first thing I want to say about mental illness and substance abuse is that when you're dealing with clients that are dealing with symptoms of either one, some of the first things that comes up are your emotional reactions to those things. Does dealing with somebody who has a mental illness, does that make you uncomfortable? Do you have judgment issues around people with addictions? That's the first thing that you have to deal with around this issue, is your own stuff that you bring to it. The second thing that you have to deal with is your agency stuff, your coworkers or policies that may impact clients who are living with substance abuse or mental illness symptoms. And then finally, other agencies. So you're advocating for this person, but how are they treated? What kind of response do they get from the services that you're trying to collaborate with to meet their needs? Remember that most people with mental illnesses are fully functional. That it may be very much like diabetes. If they have the right therapies, you won't know. They are dealing with it like any other illness, and you won't know. They are completely functional in society. Another thing is that your job is not to diagnose or treat. What I want to do is just make people aware of some of the ways that mental illness symptoms can manifest themselves, and so that you have more skills and more compassion in dealing with it, and give you a few more tools. And know that sometimes clients need a reality check. They're experiencing something that's very frightening, particularly if you do crisis line work. I found that sometimes, because we were the only show in town, there just wasn't another place where people could just randomly pick up the phone and call and say, and this is a true example, my shower head is talking to me. It's very scary. And have somebody say, well, you know what, in my reality, shower heads don't talk. And I don't think that what kinds of things is your shower head saying to you? And to kind of work with them on calming them down and realizing that that's not actually real. And sometimes I am going to go over the steps for committals, because sometimes you have to go that far in taking action to keep clients safe. Mental illness, including substance abuse, is considered a disability and falls under the Americans with Disability Act. And so any questions that you ask clients around those issues have to be made after you've made the decision to provide services. In other words, you can't determine whether or not they're eligible for services based on their disability. First you have to decide, is this person, have they been battered, have they been abused, are they eligible for services otherwise, and then you can ask what kinds of accommodations they may need. So some ideas for intake questions that might be helpful. It can be very broad. What's been helpful in the past when you've had a hard time with your thoughts or feelings? How can we help you when you're having a difficult time? Chances are they've gone a long part of their life dealing with this. They've worked out some strategies that they know work, and this is essentially part of safety planning and part of making sure that your intervention is successful with them. What can you plan for ahead of time in case they have a mental health crisis while you're working with them? Are there particular people that would be helpful to call in? And this is, again, one of those reasons why I always say guidelines are better than rules, and that we have to treat people according to what they need, not according to some universal person standard. Because here, you may not have, it may not be appropriate for you to sit down with every client and say, okay, give me a list of 2 people that we can call to come to the shelter and sit with you if you are in crisis. Yeah, it may not be appropriate for all your clients. You probably don't do that because of confidentiality issues, et cetera, et cetera. But for somebody who's really struggling with mental health symptoms, that might be a very appropriate safety plan to say, give us these people. They're safe for us to call. We can have them sign a release for confidentiality, and they can come and they can be with you. If that is somebody that helps you maintain so that you can stay here in our program. Does that make sense? I hope so. what kinds of situations might be particularly hard for you? Chances are those are exactly the situations that they're going to encounter while living in your program. Noisy, crying, being alone, crowds. It may be that holidays are particularly hard, whatever. Essentially, you're planning ahead to try and strategize how can we make things most comfortable. If you're anxious or angry, those feelings are so intense that they're impacting safety, how do you want us to react? What works for you? One client I had said that the thing that kept her from escalating was latch hooking. And so it made sense for us to go out and spend $20 on a latch hook kit as an accommodation for her staying in shelter, just as much about some other service that you might provide to a client. And I have a question here about what about clients who want help staying on track with their meds, but we're not allowed to do that. That's a place you have to be really careful because you are not a med manager. So you can't dispense medications. But what you could do is sit down with them and come up with a schedule, maybe one of the little med boxes that have the morning, afternoon, evening, anything like that, or a checkbox form they can go and they can check off and sign it themselves to keep track, and you just remind them of it. Have you looked at your schedule? Where are you at? So your role is as a reminder, not as the manager of those drugs. That's kind of where you have to walk that line. Let's see. Yeah, again, around the medications, are the medications working for them? Do they need help, filling their prescription? They may have come to you and they don't have access to their meds, and it may be something where they really need to make sure they're taking it at exactly the right time. And for them, crisis intervention means how can you get them to a doctor as quickly as possible to get their prescription refilled. It may mean that you work with them to have a visiting nurse come in and help with monitoring their meds. Okay. I mentioned the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, before in our last section. And as I said, this is the Bible. This is what people turn to classify what mental illnesses are. It says, it defines them and says, this is how you know what you got. I have to say that it is not, it's not valid across cultures. That's what I want to say. In other words, in other cultures, mental illness cannot be categorized in this way. So what that instantly means is that mental illness, how we think about it, how we diagnose it, all of that is cultural. And it's also political. It's social. So just as homosexuality used to be a diagnosable mental illness, and now there's been culture change and that's been taken off and said, nope, that's just a normal part of human sexuality. It isn't an illness. This is a living political document that changes over time. I'm personally monitoring the stuff around autism really well because I have a child who's on the autism spectrum, and there's a new version of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that's going to be released. That's kind of being released in bits and chunks right now, and it changes a lot of stuff around autism that there's some real pros and cons. One thing it did not do, and there was rumors that it was going to do, was move autism into a mood disorder. Well, that doesn't make sense, you may ask yourself. Why would that happen? Well, that was happening because of a lot of lobbying pressure from pharmaceutical companies, who of course can manufacture chemicals to change mood, but cannot produce a pill to change autism. So as I said, remember when you're talking about the DSM and what people's diagnosis is, that those are sometimes political, cultural labels, and they don't summarize what a human being is and what their experiences are. They fall into these categories. There are descriptions, brief descriptions in the handouts, in the manual, to try and clue you in broadly on what falls under these. We'll see lots of clients with anxieties and fears. Some of them will have a diagnosable anxiety disorder, where their level of anxiety does not match their reality. Some may have mood disorders. Depression would be a mood disorder. The drugs that are used to treat mental illness can do a couple different things. If the mental illness is primarily being caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain, it can change the chemical balance. So some psychotherapeutic drugs add chemicals to your brain. Now, if you don't have enough of a certain chemical, here's more of it. If your body's not manufacturing enough of it, here's some. We can give it to you from the outside. Some of them function opposite by blocking your body's use of a particular chemical. It can help in terms of alleviating emotional symptoms. Maybe the person does have an anxiety disorder, or they're depressed, et cetera, et cetera. And just by relieving that symptom enough, that person can then get by. Some folks will go, oh, well, that's just a crutch. Well, you know what? Sometimes you need a crutch. Sometimes you have to have a crutch in order to walk. So sometimes people need that chemical to alleviate the symptoms they're experiencing, and to put them at a manageable level. Lots of these drugs do have significant side effects. There are reasons why folks don't necessarily like taking their meds. It may knock them out and put them to sleep at night, and they don't like that sensation. It may make them feel emotionally numb. It may make them feel physically numb. It may block sexual functioning. It may give them a dry mouth. Tons of things that might even seem worse than the symptoms they're supposed to be helping, and people don't like that. And often it takes trying out several different types of drugs to try and figure out what works for that person's particular body. And some long-term do cause brain damage. So there are reasons people don't like taking their meds, or find that the med isn't working for them personally, even though it was the great, magic bullet for the person sitting next to them. I want you to think a little bit about grief in relation to mental illness. That not only is the person dealing with whatever their symptoms are, but there's grief that goes along with that. When you are overwhelmed by mental illness symptoms, you are vulnerable. You've had tremendous losses. You've lost often friends and family. You've lost safety. You've lost control over your own self, your own mind. You may have lost jobs. You may have lost children. You may have lost your home. And that comes with a tremendous weight of grief. You often become isolated. People think you're weird. They don't want to hang out with you. Or you simply wear them out because you are so, you have such deep needs, and they feel like they can't fulfill them, and they wear out. We still stigmatize mental illness tremendously. So there's an automatic loss of self-esteem. Am I crazy? Am I, all of those things that I see in movies and in cartoons. Everybody laughs at the crazy person. Is that me? You may feel tremendous embarrassment over what you have done. You may have an episode, and then later on, when you are more regulated, you can remember everything you did, and you are appalled. You're humiliated. You've experienced this loss of control over your own body and self. So you're dealing with two parallel things, not only the symptoms, but also the grief that goes along with that. And anything that you use in terms of helping clients to deal with grief can be helpful in talking with somebody who's experiencing overwhelming mental illness symptoms. I said I was going to cover some nuts and bolts, so I'm going to talk about the commitment process. You have somebody who says, I need help, I'm going to commit myself. The reality is it depends on their health insurance. And therefore, the reality is for a lot of our clients, they're going to have a heck of a hard time voluntarily committing themselves. If you have really super insurance that's going to pay for mental health treatment, that's what, 2 people on the planet, they may be able to go and go to the hospital and get help. In a lot of cases, they're going to be turned away unless it's absolutely an emergency, and by that I mean there's a real good chance, unless they have taken an overdose or cut themselves or have some other actual physical health crisis, there's a real good chance they'll be turned away. If they go in and try and voluntarily hospitalize themselves. Another thing is if they do say, I'm going to go in there voluntarily, I'm suicidal, the hospital does have the option of going, yep, you're suicidal, and we are going to file to commit you so that it's not voluntarily, and we're going to hold on to you until there's a hearing. So they may go in voluntarily, but then not be able to get out voluntarily. In Iowa, the code says that any interested person can file at the clerk of court's office. So it doesn't have to be a therapist. It doesn't have to be a physician. It can be your client's batterer, or it could be you, an interested person. You fill out the form at the clerk of court's office. You need one other person that will corroborate. And what you're saying is that this person is a danger to themselves or to others. And here's why. And that you have firsthand, reasonable knowledge of that any reasonable person would say, oh, yep, absolutely, this person is a danger to themselves or others. A judge will review that application. It's very much like a restraining order. A judge will then look over what you filed. Or in a lot of counties, because there's a limited number of judges, somebody has been appointed a mental health referee, which is a great job title. I wish I had that on my card. Kirsten, mental health referee. So they review it, and they have the power to then essentially issue a warrant to take that person into custody and commit them for assessment. Excuse me. Again, very similar to a restraining order, it is the sheriff's office that serves those papers and may take that person into immediate custody if, again, they are a threat. They are likely to be assigned an attorney. They will be examined once they've been taken into custody and taken to the facility. You can request, you have the right to request that you are examined by your own doctor, by a doctor of your choosing, particularly if you think that the person that is examining you will be biased. The court can order that you will be held until that examination is completed. So let's say you have filed to have a client, or the batterer has filed to have a client committed. The mental health referee can either look at it and go, nope, and dismiss it, or they set a hearing date as well, right? Again, very like a restraining order. However, in a criminal process, in most hearings, in most civil processes, you have the right to be in the room. As the respondent, you get to hear the testimony that's being put up there against you. That's not true with a mental health committal, because again, it's not a criminal charge. So you actually don't have the right to be in the room while somebody is testifying. So you might be excluded from the hearing. So a battered woman might have her batterer file to have her committed, and she may be excluded from the room while the batterer is testifying about why she's crazy. That's what it comes down to. So then at that hearing, the judge is going to make a determination of whether or not you need treatment. If they decide you do, you're placed in a facility for further evaluation. And after 15 days, within the limit, the maximum limit is 15 days, that facility has to give a recommendation for what needs to happen. The recommendation may be this person should be let go. And it may not take 15 days for that recommendation. But at the most, 15 days. And the recommendation may be this person needs to be committed for long-term treatment, this person needs to go to Cherokee for inpatient treatment, you name it. Basically, you are there until the staff says you no longer need any kind of treatment. I've said that this is, in some ways, it's kind of like other criminal or civil proceedings. The sheriff is the person that serves the papers, and they can take you into custody. If there's no place to take you, if they can't get you to the hospital, they can actually hold you in the jail for 24 hours until they can get you to a hospital. There is no other health issue where if they can't get you to the hospital, they put you in jail. You know, if you had a broken leg, they can't put you in jail for up to 24 hours until they can get you to the emergency room. But if it's a mental illness, they can. So that just shows that there's still this stigma and this different association with mental illness as being some kind of a moral failing than there is for other health issues. They could also place you with a relative or a friend, or they might place you with your domestic violence program, who is responsible to supervise you until they can get you to the hospital for evaluation. Now at this point you're saying, hey, we only deal with voluntary clients. They can't order somebody to stay with us and order us to hang on to them because we say if she wants to leave, she can go. Yeah, that's true. But if they're saying, here, we're going to either stick her in the shelter for 8 hours until we've got somebody to take her down to Des Moines, or we're going to put her in jail, chances are you're going to take her involuntarily into your program. Renee just added that in Webster County, they don't hold people in the jail for commitment unless there's also accompanying criminal charges. And that's great. And that may be true in a lot of places. Again, this probably depends on how far is the closest. How far is the closest hospital with a mental health department where they can get the assessment done? How many officers do they have to transport? It's all about resources. Mental health is all about resources. Let's see. If you are concerned that your client is being unjustly held or that client themselves, anybody can file to have that order reviewed if you feel like that person is being held unjustly, and the judge can order an inquiry. It's kind of like an appeals process to a committal. Minors, parents, or guardians can apply for voluntary commitment. The thing to know about for a parent who is seeking to have their child committed to mental health services, if I as a parent can't afford, let's say my child is schizophrenic, I can't afford treatment, insurance won't cover the treatment, et cetera, and my child is not willing to voluntarily get treatment, even if I could afford it, and I end up having to commit my child, that goes to juvenile court. In other words, my child will have to be China'd in order to get those services. In most places in the country, in order for a parent who can't afford services for their mentally ill child to get those services, in most places they have to turn over custody of their child to the court. The juvenile court can also order the entire family into treatment when it's a juvenile case, which is a good thing. But there's really not very good answers for guardians who have children with mental illnesses. People with substance abuse who are addicted, the process for committing them is exactly the same as with other mental health issues. So if you can say, my partner is an alcoholic, they are a danger to themselves, I'm afraid they're going to die from this, they drive drunk all the time, they're a danger to other people, I can go through the same commitment process. Deciding to commit somebody is not an easy choice. Don't make that decision alone. Talk about it. Is there any other community supports that might be able to prevent that? The problem with somebody who's suicidal is that they feel at that moment like they have so little control over their life that the only thing that they can control is how and when they die. And they just want to escape the unbearable pain. And when you commit somebody, in most cases, suicide watch in a hospital is being stripped perhaps naked in a cell that is bare, and you are either watched or you are on video camera 24/7, and you get to be completely vulnerable and watched and helpless. So all of those things that you were trying to avoid are intensified, and particularly if you have somebody who has experienced abuse, it's often very re-traumatizing. I don't know about you, but I really don't like to poop on camera with somebody watching me. And yet there's just not very good options otherwise for keeping the person alive. Suicide is a whole other topic, whole other section that I'm actually going to be doing a training about, so I won't go too much into suicide itself. But if there's anything else you can do before taking the step of committal, try it. And try doing the safety planning ahead of time with people of, if things start to escalate for you, how can we intervene before it gets to a crisis? Sometimes you do need to talk with people about meds. Not you should be taking your meds or why aren't you taking your meds, but I'm worried because you took more. I'm worried because you said that your meds help you to stay calm and be able to go to work, and it seems like you're not taking them anymore. Are there reasons why you're not taking them? You want to talk to me about that? In other words, engage with the discussion rather than telling them what they should and shouldn't do about their meds. If somebody is in crisis, give them space. You may want to go in there and calm them down and pat them, whatever. Don't. Back off, give them space, clear the room. And remember that unusual behavior is not necessarily dangerous. This is where some of the time what your biggest issue is dealing with other clients who are afraid of them. And also this person is talking to themselves out loud, or they're talking to the voices in their head out loud. It might be unusual behavior, but it's not really something to be scared of. And maybe just talking with that person about doing that in the room. Or that if they do that in front of the other clients, here's how the other clients are going to react. It might make it harder for the living arrangements for them. Are there safe places they can go? Can they go out to the garage if they're going to have those kind of conversations? Unusual behavior is not necessarily dangerous behavior. There is a very sweet gentleman who lives a couple houses in an apartment. He lives in my neighborhood, an apartment just a few houses away from me, who spends his days wandering around town in skirts, even in frigid weather. Actually, in very frigid weather, he wears chiffon skirts with a Santa coat and hat. And very unusual behavior, harmless as a fly, and I would miss him if he were not in my neighborhood. And he's very ostracized and very isolated because of his unusual behavior. But he's not hurting anybody. Let's see. Delusions. If you flat out say that's not happening, that's not true, there's a real good chance that you will become part of the plot. So if you have somebody who's feeling very paranoid, I can give you some examples of some of the ways that I've tried to address it. Had a client who said that ISU was monitoring her thoughts and that they were broadcasting her thoughts across campus. And rather than say, well, that's not true, that's just a crazy thought, it was, I've been on campus many times. I have never heard them. I've never heard them, and no one I know has talked about hearing somebody's thoughts broadcast on campus. Had a client who was pretty sure that the CIA was tracking her. They were bugging her car, etc. We went out and we checked in her trunk. There was no no man in black hiding in her trunk, could not find any bugs on her car. So ask them to explain their hallucination, explain that you don't see it that way. At some point, they're probably not going to be surprised that that's not real and not happening, particularly if it's a real out there hallucination. I had a partner who worked in the mental health field, and he had a client who had visual hallucinations all the time, and he pretty much learned that if there was a dinosaur on the road, you just drove through it because it wasn't real. And so he still saw them, but he had learned to pick apart what things were likely to be real and which things were not. And it wasn't a surprise to him that there wasn't a dinosaur on the street. Another thing about folks who've been living long-term with mental illness symptoms is that they are very vulnerable. People have preyed on them. They've had to use manipulation to get their needs met. They've exhausted their resources. And boundaries, 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 boundaries. You must keep things very clear what you can and cannot do, and keep solid boundaries. Make no promises you can't keep. And repeat those messages numerous times. Just because last time you talked about the difference between being an advocate and a friend doesn't mean you don't need to review it one more time during this counseling session with them. Let's see, I kind of talked about hallucinations. Again, all of this stuff is in the reading, so I'm going to rely on you completing the training in this area by, at the very least, going and reviewing that written material. I've touched on self-harm and cutting. Remember that cutting is not the same thing as a suicide attempt. It's usually not about trying to kill themselves. It's actually about trying to stay in their body and ground themselves and feel. They feel numb. I don't exist anymore. And if I cut myself, I exist. Or the pain is invisible, and if I cut myself, it makes the pain real and visible. So the best way to deal with cutting is to acknowledge it is happening, to talk about why that person is feeling the need to cut, and to find ways to build their self-capacity. You may not be able to reduce their trauma. You may not be able to make them feel safer. But what can you do to break their isolation, to increase their ability to access resources, to increase their ties to the community, to increase their self-esteem, to increase their ability to calm themselves, to change their self-talk, the tapes they play to themselves. All of those things are going to increase their self-capacity. It's going to make it easier for them to live with the amount of trauma that they've got. Alrighty. We are about out of time. So, last couple minutes, I just want to hammer home a few things about substance abuse. Lots of reasons why our folks may be using. The batterer may have forced them to use. Didn't give them any choice but to use. And it may have made them safer to just agree and use with their batterer than to refuse. Their substance may be the thing that's allowing them to keep that balance and allowing them to cope with the trauma and pain and get through the day and work. It may be that they knew if they used and helped the batterer to use that he would pass out and then he wouldn't hurt them anymore and they'd be safer. It may be that they're using prescription drugs because the doctor, rather than bothering to find out if she was safe, just gave her antidepressants because that was an easier way to get her to shut up and get her out of the office. So lots of reasons why our folks use. And then there's other reasons why we have always been reluctant as a movement to serve clients who use. One is that we don't feel like we have the training, and my answer is go learn. Pick up a book, ask somebody to come into your staff meetings and train, do co-training with your local substance abuse agency. Learn, 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 learn. We're afraid that somebody's going to OD and pass out in our office and we won't know what to do and we won't know how to freak out. We will freak out. Well, somebody may have a heart attack. It's no different. Somebody may have go into insulin coma. Somebody may have an allergic reaction and have a medical crisis. We treat those like any other medical crisis. We're worried that if somebody's using, that the kids in shelter will find the pot and that they'll use. We can't guarantee anybody safety in shelter. We pretend that it's true, but it's not true. And that kid could just as easily pick up a nickel bag on the playground. They could find a crack pipe in the alley, whether they were in shelter or not. So their safety risk is about the same as anybody anywhere else. And I can guarantee you, if I'm using, chances are I'm going to be better at hiding my drugs than you are at finding them. We are afraid that substances will make clients violent, and I hear that all the time. Well, my answer to that is that we go around training all the time that substances don't cause violence. You know, when we're talking about perps, we deal with that myth all the time. Substances do not cause violence. They make violence more dangerous. They make it scarier. They increase other barriers. They make it harder to be safer, but they're not the root cause of violence. So it's kind of ironic to turn around and say, oh, she's using, therefore she will be violent. Those are two separate issues. And we may have clients who don't use, who are just as likely to be violent. So we need to deal with the violence as a separate issue and have strategies for dealing that, rules around violence, and have that separate from how we deal with the issue of substance abuse. Maybe disruptive to group living, same argument applies. There are lots of things. Racism may be disruptive to group living. Deal with it on an individual basis when that happens, and not say, well, we're not going to deal with women who use because they might be disruptive. All that means by having policies around excluding women who use is that only the good liars will get our services. Because I can guarantee you, you are still going to be serving women who are addicts. You are still going to be using women who are using. They just now are going to be lying to you about it. And having a standard of you got to be sober first before we will help you with safety means that those women are not going to end up being safe. We have to deal with the problems at the same time. It also gives the batterer a tool to make sure she's not getting services. Okay. Any comments, questions so far? It feels crazy making to me to try and cover either one of these topics in just an hour. So I'm again relying on you reading the material. Oh, and you're an awesome trainer. Thank you. I am a rapidly speaking trainer, so I hope that I didn't go too fast. And I thank you for giving me 2 hours of your time, though. And I am always available if you have other concerns or you want me to send you information. I'd be happy to send out these PowerPoints, though a lot of the times they're way too big for people's emails. But I've pulled them from the written material. So once again, go read. And thank you. And I think, let's see, what is our next webinar? Let me exit out of here. What is our next one?